Hey everyone, it's me, Dee. I hope this video finds you well. I wanted to do a share of a flip through on a journal that I created. My inspiration was, and I don't know, I might have mentioned it, some of you may know that I am a huge genealogist and I have traced and tracked my family for years and years. So I started thinking about all the things that survived in my family. I think about my elders, the stories that were told, photographs that were shared, and I firmly believe in documenting life and leaving behind, as they say, a footprint of who you were. So I started thinking about that as a journal, and I said, what would people save like we do today when they're creating a scrapbook or a journal, and what they would jot down. My husband's family was very big in documenting things, medical records, anything really. I mean, there's journals that go back to, in his family, like the late 1800s. So it inspired me to kind of replicate of what it would be like back then to create a journal. Like we create our journals today and we have all this fancy stuff. We have punches and all our just great tools that we have that's out there for paper crafting. So I said, what would it be like to kind of step back in time and think about what they had back then to use to create a journal, which really, there wasn't much. So I figured I would do a journal, create a journal that was made out of fabric and sew it and use some paper and then sort of put in there what I think people would have chosen to save and kind of make it like generational. I've named this Gather What Remains because of what would have survived in anyone's families, and I put that into a journal. This is going to be for sale in my shop on Etsy at Golden Nest Studio. The link will be provided below. And let's start. The whole journal is hand sewed, hand tea dyed, and also with the paper, vintage trim, vintage lace. And let's open it up. I have a little heart charm right here. I have a vintage trim lace. I just left it like this so it can act like a bookmarker. All the doilies are vintage, hand tea-dyed paper. We have a pocket, and I just distressed and made the images look like old postcards. We've got some vintage buttons on some distressed paper, and I made this to look very, very vintage. Some distressed buttons, some fabric that I've sewed and created a pocket on some vintage music paper. We have a darling little girl here that I put on a charm and attached it to some ribbon, to some vintage pieces of fabric, mother of pearl buttons. We have a little boy with his little dog, a little baby. I've created this pocket here, vintage trim and fabric. On this side we have just some tags. Here's a little girl, and we have a pocket that has some little flowers in here, and it's like a vellum glassine kind of type of envelope. Oh, that was the little boy from the other side, and then just a little piece of paper that looked like a vintage newspaper, and those fit nicely in that pocket there. And then this little boy with his dog does come out, and it flips up, or excuse me, it flips up, and it's just a little flip here. And then I tied some jute rope to it. Vintage trim, hand tea-dyed paper. Over here we have some vintage hooks and eyes, a little boy, a clip that has a silhouette of a woman on it, and I distressed this to make this look like an old newspaper. A large tag, and that just gets clipped together like that. And then that all gets put into this pocket here. nicely. And we have some, I printed on some fabric and attached that on an old letter. Well, you know, it is a graphic image and I made it look old. And so it has some ribbon I attached with it. Vintage doily that has a heart charm here. Someone's vintage wedding. Some pieces of vintage paper. I have a glassine bag here that has stamps because, you know, somewhere in some family, everyone has a stamp collector. So I thought that was appropriate. A ticket pinned onto a piece of fabric, some vintage lace and some fabric here, and I have a little clock pinned and then attached to the vintage trim. So we have some tea dye paper here, vintage trim, book paper, and perhaps he's a great-grandfather, a grandfather. He goes into a pocket here. I did some fabric with a stamped image of a key. And over here on this side, we have some vintage buttons. It's amazing how heavy these buttons are. I think that's really cool. We have just a piece of paper that, or it folds in half, stamped a little rose there that kind of mimics old advertisement, like perhaps a newspaper, and that goes into this pocket over here. And then inside this pocket that is wrapped around and it slips off from this side, I printed out and distressed, made it look like some old paper, which is lined, and you know, could write on that and journal. Little fabric tab there. Perhaps they saved an old invoice or a ledger for some reason, so I printed that out and distressed it. Vintage trim, tea-dyed paper, young woman. This flips up, and some vintage fabric and a little vintage pin and trim. Here's a train ticket. Perhaps they took a family trip somewhere. And then we have a flashcard, and that goes in nicely in that pocket. And then here we have another piece of paper that I distressed and lined and put a vintage mother of pearl button on it with some shabby chic type of pieces of fabric and lace. Some old music paper and vintage trim. And here we have a woman sitting in a chair. And that goes into this pocket right here. Mother of pearl buttons. Made a pocket here with fabric. Another vintage document that I printed out. Got some journaling cards. Perhaps this at one time was some old money or some type of banknote. And here we have a key with some ribbon and fabric from that I hand tattered from that piece of fabric. I put that in there. Perhaps it goes to a hope chest somewhere. And then here, like with genealogy, love grows under a tree, and it shows the family, and I stamped a tree to represent a family tree, and then I put a little heart down here on the trunk of the tree. Vintage doily, hand-dyed tea paper. Here is a woman, and perhaps this is her little baby. Just a little piece of extra paper I had, so I folded that over and put that in there, made a little pocket out of fabric. And there's going to be tons of the hanging strings just to make it look old and shabby. If you don't like it, you could snip it off, but they will be throughout the journal. And then this was just a pocket I created, and some little tickets that I clipped on, perhaps from another trip somewhere throughout one of the families. And that's the other part of the vintage music paper. And then this is just a ledger sheet I distressed that I printed out, and it just slips on like this. Vintage, or excuse me, tea-dyed paper. A little tag here that's pinned on with a little angel, perhaps, you know, someone's baby, and that's in memory of them. More vintage doilies. On this page, we have a little vintage boy with a little pin, fabric pocket, another floral print I printed out, and in the pocket we have a flip open pocket, and it has a little girl in here, and perhaps her mother, sister, maybe an aunt. Those are nice journaling cards, and they just go right into that pocket, and then that flips down. And we've got some vintage trim, and on the back is some more fabric floral that I printed out. Put that right into that pocket. And then here, this was some type of vintage clip, or perhaps a piece of jewelry, and it clipped really nicely around the thickness of this. I created some mini postcards, and I created some mini envelopes, and in the envelopes there's little tiny pieces of paper that I put inside. And so I put these together, and then when you open up this little mini journal that I just did a real quick one signature on, I put this distressed piece of, it's like a jute type of tie. There's a cute woman in there, and then that's just a little journal that anyone can write in or put pictures in, or whatever you choose. So that goes back on there. Then this goes on here, and then that goes into the clip, and it holds nicely, and we put that back into the pocket. And some more tea-dyed paper, tea-dyed vintage trim, another letter that I've got clipped up top, vintage doily, and I have some mother of pearl buttons that I sewed and then I attached to this pin, and that hangs off and dangles from the side. And we have a perhaps someone's hanky. I have a little cutout of a jar, another ledger sheet. Those go into this fabric pocket. Some mother of pearl buttons there, vintage trim. And then this is a, it's kind of like a glassine bag, and I'm using it as like a side tuck pocket. Put some vintage fabric there for a little tab, and I have a bingo card in there, and another, could be like an invoice or receipt. And then on vellum I printed a, could be like a poem or a song, and then that goes in there. And I'm sorry, and then we have another piece of vintage, well, I made it look like vintage, and it's a piece of tea-dyed paper. And then this one can flip over. I have it clipped up here, but when, let's just take it off just to show you the effect. And then if you take this off and you open it up, I made a long pocket, and I put a map in here because I'm sure that the families traveled, a map of North America, and that was perhaps a map that survived in the family. I'm sure they took a steamship somewhere, because back in the day, that's pretty much how you traveled, way back when. And then we have a religious card and some vintage fabric and trim with a piece of tea-dyed paper, book paper, tea-dyed paper. And then this I just created as like a long envelope tuck that you could put something in, and that's also clipped, so that comes unclipped. And here inside the signature, I just left a long strings from tying the signature and creating it, and then I have these little tiny keys attached. envelope. And here we just have a couple and a piece of paper that you journal on. It's printed some floral there. And book paper, another portrait of a family, and perhaps their little dog. He had a little photo shoot. Some tea-dyed paper. And this is the other half of that glassine bag I was telling you about. And just a large card here with some numbers printed on it that kind of go with like the flashcards. And here's another flashcard with some vintage lace on top, and I printed on vellum. I think that looks so pretty. And then we have a key stamped on a tag, some vintage trim, and that's just a corner tuck. Vintage doily. Some more tea-dyed paper. And then we have a belly band here with some more lined paper. It's all been hand distressed. Vintage, or excuse me, vellum printed on. Put that in there. And then more vintage doily. And on the back here I did some scraps of and sewed around it vintage fabric, and then their pet cat. Put him in the back. And then that's the back of the journal. Plus you have your cabinet cards. So that is what I've created. I hope that you enjoyed the video. And again, like I said, this will be in my shop. So take a look at it. And I appreciate all of my subscribers. If you're new, welcome. And please subscribe and like anything, because it really helps the algorithm on YouTube. And I hope you guys enjoyed the video. So I will talk to you guys soon. Thanks. Bye.